Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larry Stevens. I'm the curator of biology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And we've been holding a series of discussions of the biology and ecology of Grand Canyon over the last six months or so. And today I'd like to talk about the birds of Grand Canyon. So I entitled this talk, "The Raptors of the Deep." And with each of these lectures, I'd just like to remind the audience that of the museum's lengthy history of science and research on the northern Colorado Plateau in northern Arizona, and some of our more prominent curators of biology and collaborators here at the Museum of Northern Arizona. Walter McDougall in the top right there was a botanist for the whole region for about 60 years. He sampled in Grand Canyon extensively, wrote books on the vegetation there. Eddie McKee was the first naturalist from Grand Canyon National Park, and he was a dear colleague and worked here at the museum. Stephen Carruthers, beginning about 1970 or so, was curator of biology, the position I hold now. He was a very prominent ornithologist and led the first ecological inventory of Grand Canyon National Park that I got to participate on back in the mid-70s, and established all kinds of precedents for improving park monument management strategies. Where are we? Grand Canyon is kind of in the middle of the Colorado River Basin. This is a 1,400-mile long river network that flows from Wyoming all the way down to the Sea of Cortez. Grand Canyon portion of it, deeply incised in the Colorado Plateau, here in northern Arizona, southern Utah, and some of Nevada as well. It occupies, the river occupies 8 states in 2 countries, and it's really the leading river of the Southwest, providing water and hydroelectric power for about 40 million people. And yet we want to manage it in its natural condition in Grand Canyon. Each of these talks has emphasized the importance of understanding geologic history as well as recent history in terms of understanding what we have in Grand Canyon and how it relates to previous landscapes, previous geologic time periods. For much of Grand Canyon, you know, it's a landscape that attracts international attention, and it's a designated World Heritage Site. And really important to understand that this, in the context of being able to look at Grand Canyon geologically, we can see evidence of virtually every natural type of ecosystem that's ever existed on Earth, from deepest profundal ocean to high mountain habitats to burning volcanic situations, from deserts that are incredibly dry, lakes, oceans, rivers, swamps. All these habitats occurred at Grand Canyon over time. And the really remarkable thing about the canyon is that we can see evidence of these stacked in nicely chronologically ordered time. So it's just a fabulous environment for trying to understand the consequences and extent of past environmental change. But the landscape we're looking at in Grand Canyon really didn't come into focus really until the Miocene, 15 million years or so ago. It's undergone a number of important changes that have affected all manner of its geomorphology, the life in it, and how those interact. During Pliocene times, the landscape became much more deeply incised. It was subject to desertification as the Sierra Nevadas rose up and created a rain shadow, and promoted the evolution of drought-adapted species like cacti, et cetera. In late Pliocene times, 2.6 million years ago, South America touched North America for the first time. Consequences not only for plants and animals that are terrestrial being able to move northward or southward, but also for species of birds that came into our landscape. During Pleistocene times, over the last 2 million years, enormous volcanic dams have formed. Glacial climate has come in, and in recent times, more desertification during what we call the Neogene. Okay, so today's focus, why do we bother studying birds? Well, they certainly attract a lot of attention to us. Their songs, their bright colors, etc. We've got about just a little less than 10,500 bird species recognized on Earth. 11% of those are threatened with extinction, and 1.3% of those have gone extinct recently. So humans are having a big impact on birds to the extent that we can appreciate them. We are creating habitat conditions that are not supporting them. Birds are often very highly habitat specific, have complex migrations. They are interesting species in terms of integrating environmental quality across broad regions, so they can serve as sensitive indicators of environmental change. But as you see in this figure here, that the birds really suffer a great deal of extinction, more extinct birds than any other vertebrate group, with the exception of possibly fish. There's a lot of uncertainty about the fish, and so, but birds are really very prominently studied, commonly studied, and we're losing them. To put birds into perspective, we have 20 billion chickens on Earth, and birds are the direct. They're basically just dinosaurs. They're very close to being very close to the dinosaur lineage. They didn't really arise until about 66 million years ago. This last March, the fossils of this Asteriornis were discovered, and that's the earliest bird known. But noted that it predates the extinction of the dinosaurs. So birds were already established, and probably quite well established during the Cretaceous period, just before the extinction of the dinosaurs. Incredible amount of work has gone on with bird genetics in the last decade. Prom et al. 2013 and some subsequent papers have pulled together the genetics of the entire lineage. So these two columns of branched networked information are meant to be stacked on top of each other, looking at their evolutionary relationships. The most ancestral birds that we have that are still extant are things like ostriches. These ratites, some of which are still with us, some of which recently have passed into extinction, like the moas. These kind of genetic analyses show us relationships that are, some of them are to be expected, and some of them are kind of surprising. Hawks and owls, for example, in the upper right corner of the diagram, are relatively closely related and have arisen from common ancestors. A surprise is in the middle of this diagram on the right side, in which you see that the falcons and the parrots are actually more closely related than falcons are to the other hawks. So that's quite provocative and quite interesting. It makes sense when you begin to think about these things in a just a perspective intelligence fashion. Falcons are very smart. Some of the parrots are incredibly intelligent birds, but until we get the genetics part of the story put together, we can't really see that. And but here's a kind of a surprise in the bird phylogeny story. Now, this diagram is just for extant birds. It doesn't show us the extinct lineages, 10,500 species. 100 times more birds have existed than that over geologic time in the last 66 million years, and those are not represented in this diagram. For example, one of the species that came from South America, one of the groups that came from South America up into North America 2.6 million years ago, were the phosphoracids, and these are birds that we are so lucky we did not encounter. They were a branch of birds that came that drifted with as South America separated from Africa 60 million years ago or so, leaving a few relatives in Africa and that came into Europe. But for the most part, they developed in South America. Giant, meaty birds that could run at 30 miles an hour, stood 10 feet tall, weighed a ton, and these are birds that wouldn't even think about twice about eating us for lunch, and could run us down with no trouble at all. So South America is a free-floating island these phosphoraceids were the dominant predators on the pampas and the open habitats of South America. They came came north into North America and lasted here till about 2 million years ago or so. Terrifying group of birds. We're so lucky we didn't actually have to experience them. And then the diagram also shows that our most derived birds are the songbirds, and particularly the sparrows. So when you see a junco or a white-crowned sparrow feeding at your feeder here this winter, those are the most highly derived, the birds that are most different from the ancestral birds. And much of the radiation of birds has gone on with these passeriform songbirds. Okay, so why study birds in Grand Canyon? As I mentioned, Grand Canyon is a World Heritage Site. It's been designated as an important bird area, an IBA. It supports at least 277 species among multiple ecosystems. This is nearly 1/3 of the entire fauna of birds in continental USA. So, who wouldn't want to know more about the birds there? Today, I want to talk about the geography a little bit of Grand Canyon, talk about birds across elevation. We'll look at raptors of the deep, raptors that are coming through the landscape, and then the birds of the middle and upper elevations. Talk a little bit about migration, talk about the future of birds in Grand Canyon with population and habitat restoration. So with each talk, I point out that Grand Canyon is not a simple landscape by any means. There's an eastern basin of Grand Canyon that's separated from the western basin. And the separation point comes where Havasu Creek meets the Colorado River. It's about a 20-mile section of the river that is virtually cliff from river to rim, and therefore no habitat. It is actually a barrier for some birds like phainopeplas and others that can't come in from high because they don't live up high. They can't really come up along through that corridor along the river at all. So that's an important landscape barrier within Grand Canyon as an overall landscape feature. Also really important to remember in this landscape that elevation matters completely, because elevation controls climate. And C. Hart Merriam, who worked in the Flagstaff area here back in the 1889, 1890, was the first to recognize that these life zones are vertically stacked in our high elevation lands, across elevation in our landscape, going from desert scrub at the lowest elevation to Arctic alpine habitat at the uppermost elevation. So across the 3.5 kilometers of elevation gradient that we have here in northern Arizona, the vegetation is assembled in that fashion. Vegetation is often the habitat for birds, and therefore elevation matters a whole lot in terms of the bird distribution. Now, that's because moisture varies by elevation. You get much more moisture at the upper elevations than we do at the lower. I think 5 inches of rain on the Colorado River at Lee's Ferry, and probably up to 40 inches or so on average per year and up in the Arctic alpine here. So 8 times more precipitation as you move across this elevation gradient. But where the water is matters a lot. And that has to do with how groundwater moves through the stack of sediments that we've got here in the Grand Canyon region, and where water comes out as springs. The blue dots here on this diagram are springs, and groundwater flow flows from the San Francisco Peaks area in both directions, north and south, to come out in the Verde Valley as well as in Grand Canyon. So you've got aquatic habitats like Lower Nankoweap Spring here in Grand Canyon that are fed by water that's coming from long distance, perhaps very long time periods, 3,000 to 10,000 years in some cases. So, and these patches of wet habitat are often very important to where you find the birds in the landscape. Our studies of springs through the Museum of Northern Arizona's Spring Stewardship Institute has reported that there may be 3 to 5 times as many bird species and orders of magnitude higher densities of birds at springs, even though they're little tiny patches of habitat, as compared to the surrounding landscape. So water really matters. And one thing that's happened to water in the Southwest, of course, is that is that the Colorado River, which was back in the previous century, at the beginning of the previous century, an uncontrolled raging torrent, has been subjected to flow regulation by the imposition of more than a dozen large dams. And so the Colorado River has been dammed by many dams. Glen Canyon Dam stands upstream from Grand Canyon and controls virtually all the water that comes through Grand Canyon National Park. The impacts of this dam were that we lost a huge amount of habitat in Glen Canyon, which is frankly an inexcusable environmental loss that would not be tolerated today, but it was back in the 1940s and 50s when those decisions were being made. The downstream effects of the dam are that it resulted in flood control. It's because the dam captures all the sediment that the Colorado River once carried. The downstream water has a greatly increased water clarity. The water comes out kind of low in the reservoir, so it's cold, uniformly cold, and doesn't vary very much, stenothermic. And collectively, this has decoupled the river from climate. So it's stabilized the Colorado River corridor downstream from Grand Canyon and downstream from Glen Canyon Dam, and it's made it a much more predictable environment. This has resulted in economic and recreational benefits and amenities. It's a very much more predictable river that we can run down there. It's greatly increased primary productivity, meaning plants are able to grow in the river. Those support invertebrates, and birds come along and can feed on some of those invertebrates. It's also, because of the flood control, increased shoreline vegetation, and therefore there's more habitat along the river than there was in pre-dam time. Interestingly, one study I worked up, we couldn't find any evidence that we'd lost any water bird species in Grand Canyon. I went through the whole list of 60 water bird species, couldn't find any that had actually were no longer there, and several that have come in since the time of the dam. So this business about the dam controlling the river, the upper graph here is the normal flow pattern of the dam. Down below is the post dams here. So where were we? We were talking about how the dam modified the river, creating a more stable environment, clear, cold water that is now supporting a great many more aquatic invertebrates in the river. So that's important for fisheries, but also important for things that eat fish. Colorado River has 20 non-native fish species, as well as 5 native fish species that are left. These non-native fish are wreaking havoc on native fish throughout the river basin. Native fish in Grand Canyon are doing surprisingly well, but these aquatic invertebrates and fish are now providing food for raptorial water birds like bald eagles, as well as diving waterfowl. So as a result of the dam, and as a result of some environmental changes up to the north, bald eagles now come into Grand Canyon during the winter months. And this invasion of Grand Canyon by bald eagles began in 1983 after up in the Flathead River system, the Game and Fish Department up there introduced mysid shrimp that wiped out the food base for the kokanee salmon that had been stocked into that system. And that at that time, that was the largest concentration of bald eagles in 48 states. Without those fish, those eagles dispersed, and not surprisingly, they because they're very wide ranging, they began to come into Grand Canyon, where they feed on non-native trout and actually benefit from highly fluctuating dam flows. The dam flows create stranding pools. Trout serially try to kill themselves by going into the stranding pools, and bald eagles could just step in to pick up trout there. They also moved into the streams like Nankoweap Creek, in which the trout spawn. And so we've seen up to 29 eagles in one kind of setting in Grand Canyon during the winter months. Just about this time of year is when they begin to congregate. But the eagles are easily disturbed by passing boats, and they're not being very well monitored. They're not being monitored at all right now. So it's but it's a really kind of interesting story of how this top predator discovers resources in the highly modified Colorado River downstream from Grand Canyon and takes advantage of those. So that's kind of interesting. Osprey also moved in the river corridor during the spring fall months. Not nesting yet, but yes, nesting up at near Glen Canyon Dam. There's one nest up there for Osprey. No bald eagle nests in Grand Canyon yet, though. So stabilizing the flows of the river also created a lot of riparian vegetation that is encroaching down towards the river. Really interesting story there about the flora. We'll present that in a future talk. Nearly half of the 1,800 species of plants in Grand Canyon are found within about 500 feet of the river surface. Almost 11% of those are non-native, so that's kind of interesting. That's also a corridor for non-native plant invasion. And the non-native plants are most abundant in the river corridor. But as you can see from this diagram that Steve Carruthers developed from that inventory I was talking about back in the mid-70s, that pre-dam time, the river had virtually no vegetation along the shorelines. It was all scoured away by the annual big floods that came through. In post-dam time, quite a profusion of riparian vegetation has come in. And so that's created habitat. And that habitat is quite mixed. Some of it is riparian tree-like species like the Gooding willow you can see in the background here, but a lot of marshes also developed in post-dam time. And that wetland vegetation is very much used and desired by a whole suite of species, rails and say common yellowthroats and other species like that. So we've done a bunch of work on identifying those habitat changes and the birds associated with them. In terms of water birds, 6 feeding guilds of water birds. This is based on a paper we completed in 1997 with a whole slew of co-authors. 25 years of observations of water birds through the river corridor. Wading birds, fishing raptors, again, the osprey and bald eagle. Many diving ducks, quite a few shorebirds. Dabbling ducks are quite common, and kingfishers. Kingfishers are kind of a standalone guild of water birds. So all these species, 60 species of water birds were able to come into the river corridor. Well, they existed in the river corridor prior to the dam, but now their abundance is much greater. And some of them, mallard ducks, several of the duck species, and even ospreys have begun to breed in the river corridor, also great blue herons. So these are quite novel changes because the river is a much more productive place for these things. And if we look at how they're distributed through the months of the year, just looking at the total number of birds per square kilometer of water per hour, pretty dramatic increase in the winter months. Just note that this is a log scale, 1,000 birds per square kilometer per hour detected in the winter months, and much lower concentrations in the summer. A bunch of these are now breeding mallard, for example, that are there in the summer months. Interestingly, a paper that Steve Carruthers and his son Tanner are just working up now is that Canada geese have begun to breed in the Lake Mead Reach, the lowermost portion of Grand Canyon, and that's a pretty big change as well. These are very conspicuous birds, and the numbers are increasing pretty actively there. So pretty big changes in terms of the water birds over time in this system. But water birds attract peregrine falcons. Grand Canyon supports the largest breeding population of peregrine falcon in any land management unit in the 48 states. Peregrine falcons were not present in the river corridor to any great extent up in the mid-70s when we began studying them. But late in that decade, the Peregrine Fund was able to begin releasing peregrines into the Western US. Many of these birds have found their way into Grand Canyon, where they're now successfully breeding. And most of the nests are occurring along the Colorado River. So this is yet another new top predator coming into the highly modified river system because of clear water, invertebrates and fish, marsh and shoreline production habitat that's created for water birds, and are playing a big role in the landscape as top predators. So we've been able, with the help of all the Colorado River guys, peregrines feed on. We found that most of their prey base are water birds, but there's a very interesting story there. And again, if you're interested in any of these papers, I'm happy to send them to you. Just let me know. So peregrine falcons attempt to catch a large number of swifts and swallows. You know, almost a third of their time, these birds are seen chasing swifts and swallows, which are little tiny birds. Those swifts and swallows only make up a tiny fraction of the actual biomass that peregrines capture. Why are they doing this? Well, swallows and swifts they tend to fly away from the cliff and the land surfaces, so they might be like play items for peregrines, places where young peregrines can test their skills, coming in at stooping in at speeds of 235 miles an hour, trying to catch these little tiny prey items, but away from the land, so they're not going to crash into anything. Perhaps we might think of that as kind of play, but it's practice for capturing other things. And as you can see, the other big portion of their diet are water birds that make up most of the actual food mass that they consume. So interesting to be able to interview so many river guides and verify their ability to identify peregrine falcons, collect their observations, put this all together, and see how the ecology of this species works. Peregrine falcons also feed pretty commonly on wasps and some other things that are in the landscape. So including lizards and whatnot. So really interesting story there, how they're adapting to this novel environment. Now, as I mentioned, the shoreline vegetation is not just marshy vegetation that supports water birds, but it's also woody vegetation like tamarisk. Tamarisk is a non-native plant, widely reviled in the Southwest as being water consumptive. Sometimes it's been described as the scourge of the West because it excludes native trees. But there's been a fair amount of controversy about its habitat quality for birds. And in Grand Canyon, these are just some of the neotropical migrant birds that nest in tamarisk: blue grosbeaks and summer tanagers and yellow warblers and hummingbirds and flycatchers. And so a wide array of our birds in the riparian neotropical migrant birds in Grand Canyon nest preferentially in tamarisk. And adding more gas to that particular fire is the southwestern willow flycatcher, which is an endangered bird, but it nests preferentially in tamarisk. 88 to 95% of the about 300 willow flycatcher nests that have been detected in the Southwest and Arizona are in tamarisk. And this is a species that comes back year after year after year to the same branch, even to build its nest. Has a great fidelity to individual trees. So tamarisk has been designated as part of the critical habitat for this bird. And this kind of adds a tone to the discussion about tamarisk as bird habitat, because at low elevations, tamarisk is regarded as being poor habitat by Bob Omar and his colleagues. Whereas in Grand Canyon, slightly higher elevation settings, tamarisk is relatively good habitat. It supports a huge number of leafhoppers and other insects. So it's very productive in terms of insect production, and the willow flycatcher can presumably feed on some of those insects. However, tamarisk has been subject to biological control, not intentionally, as it turns out, but here in the Southwest, because a beetle that feeds on it was released in Texas and northern Nevada, not intending to have it come into the Southwest here, but it came in through some introductions in southern Utah. And as you can see, the background of this picture, tamarisk is actually completely defoliated by this leaf beetle, and eventually it kills the plant. So the habitat that's preferred by southwestern willow flycatcher and kind of a lot of other neotropical migrant birds in the Grand Canyon area has now been eliminated, and that leaves only baccharis and some other kind of less desirable plants that have very low habitat quality in much of the river corridor. So interesting story, changing environments. This is the introduction of the leaf beetle has certainly contributed to the loss of willow flycatcher habitat in northern Arizona, and it could actually be responsible ultimately for the extinction of this bird. Okay, stepping up out of the river corridor to the upland birds like black-throated sparrows and a couple of scrub-dwelling vireos and canyon and rock wrens. We have a large number of birds that live in the arid uplands of Grand Canyon. Common raven is one of those. And what is common about the common raven? Absolutely nothing. This is probably the smartest bird. Stories go on and on and on. Humans are not smart enough to create experimental designs and tests to see how smart ravens actually are. Their ability to remember and understand what's going on around them, their ability to learn is just off the charts. So, they're also very hard to study because they're very wide-ranging, all across elevation, coming into all kinds of habitats. We see sometimes congregations of 200 to 300 ravens in the fall months, and we can't even begin to guess what's being communicated amongst all those birds. Mexican spotted owl is an upland species found pretty broadly across the Four Corners area, Four Corners states. These are medium-sized owls, dark-eyed owls, and they tend to live in habitats that are especially along the south rim, in cliff-dominated habitats with coniferous forest. Few records for the north side of Grand Canyon, but for the most part, the breeding records in our region here in Grand Canyon are on the south side. And the habitats, as you can see in this picture, steep cliffs with crevices that support vegetation. The owls tend to be cliff nesting, a cliff nesting species. One thing about Grand Canyon is quite interesting geomorphically is that, and kind of politically, is that we map our landscapes in 2 dimensions. And the Park Service thinks it manages 1.19 million acres of the national park. But that's plan view. And one thing Grand Canyon is not is a plan view landscape. It's a vertical landscape. And if you do a 3-dimensional analysis of the landscape area of Grand Canyon, the area jumps by by nearly 30%. I think 26% increase in land area if you include the cliffs. So for species like peregrine falcons and species like spotted owls and California condor, we really have a very poor understanding of the actual habitat area that they're occupying because we map in plan view. All right, so a large array of birds that comes through, and another whole set that comes up that's common on the or detected largely on the rims. But to get to the subject of bird migration in Grand Canyon, we understand Grand Canyon is a large, deep canyon, the most prominent, most famous large, deep canyon on Earth, not the deepest one, but the most famous. It serves as a corridor for movement of, particularly of things like monarch butterflies, certainly for fish in the pre-dam time, perhaps bats. We don't really know too much about bats. And it also functions as a barrier and a refuge. For the river corridor, through Grand Canyon, the river functions as a migratory corridor for water birds, but not for songbirds. So our water birds come through the landscape following the water. And sometimes we get species coming following the water that are quite surprising. There are 2 records of magnificent frigate bird following the Colorado River up through Grand Canyon. These are very distinctive marine bird that when they get blown off course, follow the water. Our waterfowl stay along the water. When you're on a river trip and you come across a bald eagle, it'll fly up every time your boat gets close to it, follows the water. It's very unusual for these water birds to when they get near a feature as big as the Colorado River to move away from it. So they tend to follow the river. But songbirds and other migratory birds moving across the landscape do not. They may drop in and spend a little bit of time restoring their food resources and whatnot, but then they move out and they're not following the river per se. Charles Van Riper's been very capably shown that in the lower Colorado River Basin. We've got the East Kaibab monocline as this big kind of uplifted region on the north rim. On the east side of it, it creates a migratory corridor for hawks. And we've now had more than 20 years of monitoring of hawks during September, October, led by Hawk Watch International and other organizations. Several dozen hawk species have been detected, hawk and vulture species have been detected on that migration route. If you go to Lipan Point or Yaqui Point in September, late September, and arrive there in the morning, say 10 in the morning, the thermals are beginning to develop. You can look down and sometimes see as many as 10 different species of raptors lazily wafting their way up to the rim. They reach the rim, and every one of them looks around as it comes into this broad, flat plateau landscape, sees the San Francisco peaks, and makes straight for the San Francisco peaks. So it's a really incredible experience to go out and see that. Lipan Point in late September is pretty much a must for anybody that really likes birds in northern Arizona. Now on the west side of the East Kaibab of the Kaibab uplift is Grand Wash Cliffs and this landscape that's also equally cliff bound and creates good thermals in uplift. All the hawks of Nevada focus into that landscape and then come southward, probably along the Hurricane Cliffs, the Grand Wash Cliffs, and we have almost no data out there whatsoever. So it's basically not yet studied. But there could be another very, very prominent hawk migration going on out in that in western Grand Canyon. Very remote landscape, very hard to study, but might be very fruitful for looking at another hawk migration route. Okay, so from those hawk migration data, some things have been revealed that are interesting or alarming. We have two species of eagles at our landscape here, bald eagle and golden eagle. These are both protected under the Eagle Protection Act, and but they don't get very much attention. By assembling the data on hawk migration from the Lipan Yaqui Point data for Grand Canyon, Hawk Watch International has been able to point out and illustrate the fact that bald eagle populations fluctuate. They seem to be more or less holding their own over time, whereas golden eagle populations are declining, and that's kind of bad news for golden eagles. It sets up a whole another dynamic in terms of conservation that we probably need to be paying attention to. This is not about landscape connectivity for a terrestrial species, but the kind of landscape connectivity that eagles and raptors need. So for at least this one species of raptor, and probably for several others like American kestrel, Aplomato falcon, and others, there may be declines going on that we really can't detect without this kind of long-term analysis. And places like Lipan Point, where these species come across in a regular fashion. We do have examples of recently extirpated species in Grand Canyon. Sage grouse was one record for the North Rim, one record for pileated woodpecker on the North Rim. These are species that have not been detected in the last 80 years or so. And I mentioned the Willow Flycatcher is also now extirpated from Grand Canyon National Park. We have about half a dozen sensitive bird species in the landscape: California condor, Willow Flycatcher, northern goshawk, Mexican spotted owl, the two eagles, yellow-billed cuckoo. One record at least Ferry from about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, but none recently. That is a bird that really requires gallery cottonwood forest to really be successful. There's also downstream concern for the Yuma clapper rail, but that's never been actually detected in Grand Canyon yet, as far as I can tell. Park Service has been monitoring for those occasionally. California condor, though, is a remarkable story. This is a species of bird that was virtually extinct, and but previously occupied a huge range of Western North America, feeding on whales along the coast And back in the day, Pleistocene animal kills in the landscape on the Colorado Plateau, and it's our largest vulture in North America, largest remaining vulture. So quite an impressive species, but the loss of habitat and especially its sensitivity to lead led it into decline. So it was lost from Arizona in the early 1900s, driven very close to extinction with, I think, just 21 birds left in California. After much controversy, those remaining birds were brought into captivity and reared, courtesy of the Peregrine Fund. And then the bird was reintroduced into Arizona in 1996. There's an ongoing population augmentation program in Arizona. We've got about 90 birds flying now. A really good place to see these is if you drive up to towards Page, but go up 89A, Highway 89A, and stop at the Marble Canyon Bridge. You can often see California condors there. The hack site for them, the release site, is up on top of the Paria Plateau, just nearby there. So this has been a really successful program of bringing birds back into the environment. There are a few nesting records now. They're beginning to nest again, but they remain very, very susceptible to lead poisoning. And until the state of Arizona really gets its act together and more strongly encourages hunters to shift to non-lead bullets, then we'll still have problems with lead poisoning, not just for condors, but for many other organisms, including the hunters themselves, because lead is a very deleterious element to put in your body. Another really piece of good news is that certain parts of the river corridor are being restored. Here's an example of some work up at Lee's Ferry in 2001. This was a dense stand of tamarisk. Bird habitat, yes, but not great bird habitat. We, through the Grand Canyon Wildlands Council, we came in 2002, 2003, stripped out the tamarisk, replanted with all native vegetation, and within a couple years, we had 3 times as many neotropical migrant birds nesting in that landscape as we did when it was occupied by tamarisk. This effort to restore riparian habitat has taken place upstream in Glen Canyon, and also through Grand Canyon National Park, downstream in the main body of Grand Canyon at one site. And there's now active ongoing work at Grand Canyon to do more habitat restoration along the river. Colorado River could be, in the wider reaches anyway, could be gallery cottonwood forest that would support birds like yellow-billed cuckoo and some of these other species that are at risk, as well as a whole host of neotropical migrants that have lost their habitat elsewhere. So, so as much encouragement and support as we can give for doing riparian habitat restoration, that seems like a really good idea. So I hope this has been a useful, informative talk for you. We've mentioned that Grand Canyon supports nearly 1/3 of the birds in the 48 states. So it's a really rich environment to go bird watching, and to keep track of what you see. Colorado River supports a very rich fauna, 24 neotropical migrants, 60 waterbird species, complex population adjustments and adaptation going on in relation to the modified dam-controlled environment there. Across and through migration is a regionally important phenomenon, very attractive to bird watchers, and with some very useful information to keep track of, like the declines in golden eagles coming out of that information. There are multiple at-risk and some missing species now in the landscape, and certainly within the mission of the Park Service, of the NGOs that are in the landscape, like Grand Canyon Trust, Grand Canyon Wildlands Council, and others, and the Museum of Northern Arizona, in terms of keeping track of this kind of information. We want to minimize the amount of future loss in the landscape. Population restoration is possible for some species. California condor is a good example of that. And habitat restoration is quite possible. The more we do, I think the better results will be for retaining neotropical migrant bird species in the landscape. All right. So with that, get out and go birding. I could tell you that the best place to bird in Grand Canyon is at Cliff Spring off the North Rim, which you can get to pretty easily after the 15th of May. It's a small, very isolated spring. It's about maybe a quarter-mile walk down a little trail out near let's see, Point Royale, and that looks down into Nanquip. But because it's so remote, it attracts an incredible number of birds. So if you sit there in the morning and watch what comes in, you'll be amazed at how many birds come in to use that spring. All right, please keep track of your information and let us know what you see. It's great to be able to document more about the bird life in Grand Canyon.